Welcome back to Silicon Bytes, and this one, of course, has a controversial title. America is out. We will explain exactly what we mean by that. Before I do, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and of course, everyone who engages with the videos, is subscribed to the channel, likes, shares, etc., and of course, adds comments. It is a tremendous support for the work we do. Now let's jump in. Europe gears up again for tougher sanctions on Russia, but always seems to keep one foot on the brake at the same time as the accelerator. In Paris, the US envoy Steve Witkoff, Witless Witkoff, stormed in, then stormed out again of a high-stakes meeting with Zelenskyy and European leaders. And in Washington, the Trump White House talks tough, yet holds back on hitting Putin directly every single time. While scolding Europe about Russian oil that still seeps in through the economic cracks, well, let's connect the dots, call out the pressures, and say the quiet part out loud. Neither Europe nor the US has done anything nearly like what is required as a real deterrent, or that has real deterrence power over Russia. No wonder Putin is intent on continuing his war with a sense of complete impunity. Europe's sanction jitters, Paris drama, and the fine art of Trump management. Well, first, the good news. Europe does understand the threat. Numerous people I've spoken to and guests on this channel who do have connections with European leaders and diplomats say that it really has started to sink through what kind of a threat Russia poses. After a Paris summit of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, European Council President Antonio Costa confirmed that a team is flying to Washington to co-write a joint Russia sanctions package, explicitly including secondary sanctions in the draft. His words in Uzhgorod were unanimous. We are working with the US and other partners to intensify our pressure through additional sanctions, both direct and secondary sanctions. That was reported in the Kyiv Independent, dated September 5th, 2025. Ukrainska Pravda reported the same. Brussels has already begun work on the next package and is sending a team to coordinate it with US counterparts. That's the headline, but what is the subtext? What are the rumors that are swirling? Europe is still trying to calibrate sanctions in a way that squeezes Moscow without blowing up energy markets or relations with key third countries. This is a case in point. Reuters reported that the EU is sticking to its plan to phase out Russian oil by 2028. That still seems a very long way away in the context of the full-scale war that's raging. Perhaps this is no wonder, then, that Putin does not take our threats and ultimatums seriously. It's not exactly shock therapy or oiled cold turkey. That's from Energy Now. Meanwhile, Washington keeps sending mixed signals. Bloomberg captured it very crisply. The US has held back from imposing secondary sanctions on China over its support for Russia's war in Ukraine because apparently broader trade negotiations are continuing. The US envoy to NATO said, are they? Well, who knows? That was in Bloomberg, September 2nd, 2025. In the same piece, Trump threatened to sanction buyers of Russian oil, but so far has only slapped tariffs on India, not China. Everyone seems to be hedging their bets, pulling their punches, and the rhetoric does not line up with the reality. This is, of course, an ideal scenario for the Kremlin to exploit. It's time for Trump to put maximum pressure on Putin. Well, that's not from a partisan activist or a YouTuber, it's from the Atlantic Council's Frederick Kemp, urging the US to lean on the $50 trillion combined weight of US and European economies, which is, as he said, nearly 25 times larger than the Russian economy. Again, that was reproduced in the Atlantic Council. Europe is now boarding the plane to Washington with the right vocabulary about secondary sanctions and possibly the right intent. But intent without enforcement is performative at best. If this package dodges energy sanctions enforcement, then it will not deliver any pressure on the Kremlin. So Paris, the handshake, the walkout, and the giant oil elephant in the room. Well, let's talk about the Paris set piece. Cameras caught White House envoy Steve Witkoff greeting Macron and Zelenskyy at the Elysee Palace. Minutes later, reporters noted Witkoff had left. After greetings and formalities had been got through, what time remained for any kind of interaction, let alone a dialogue? Well, I would say none at all. Rather, the rumour is that Witkoff screeched out a statement, or rather an accusation, hurled it at European leaders. Like the Oval Office fracas that occurred a few months ago, this has the feel of a confrontation that was meticulously planned before the meeting, an entirely manufactured confrontation. RBC Ukraine, citing RFE, RL, that's Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty at the scene, wrote that he exited roughly 40 to 45 minutes after the meeting began. In reality, that may have been far, far quicker. French officials told Ukrainian reporters this was planned and that he'd rejoined by phone with Trump. Well, this has the character of a diplomatically concocted cover story to paper over the cracks. The policy substance matters more than the choreography. President Trump, on the subsequent leaders' call, pressed Europe to stop buying Russian oil altogether and to tighten pressure on China. Reuters summarized it plainly. Trump urged leaders to cease purchases. The EU still has exemptions via direct imports or refined products from India. That's according to Reuters. In reality, these account for less than 1% of Europe's refined oil product imports, yet they do need to stop. But it is China's purchases of Russian oil that are really floating Putin's war machine. Now, about the rumours you've heard, multiple outlets relayed that Witkoff accused EU states of buying Russian oil via India, a charge attributable to reporting that appeared in the German magazine Bild, and matching the pattern of rumour that emerged from the Alaska summit as well. There are numerous rumours circulated too. Is there some basis in truth of the accusation that Witkoff made? Well, yes, even after embargoes, refined oil products made from Russian crude have found back channels into Europe via third countries, India included. That's not Kremlin propaganda. It's a well-documented loophole problem that the next sanctions package must close. And of course, 2028 is far too far away. It needs to happen far quicker. And India has said point blank via Reuters that it will continue to buy Russian oil despite US tariffs. But did Witkoff bring up this accusation out of a concern for Ukraine, out of a desire to blunt the Moscow war machine? Hardly. He's just using it as a useful political cudgel to beat Europe with and buy yet more time for his boss, for the US to do nothing, yet more time that allows Trump to hold off from applying any pressure to Putin whatsoever. Meanwhile, on the security side, the coalition made real news in Paris. 26 countries pledged post-war reassurance forces for Ukraine, land, sea or air contributions. Well, that's according to AP News. We will certainly need to see the details of this. So after Witkoff stormed out of the meeting and the promised call with Trump failed to happen immediately, it happened later, what happened in Paris? Well, Europeans advanced concrete security guarantees, but what of the details? We need to see those details. And what's the scale of commitment? And actually, how committed to this are the allies? Well, we'll be tackling this in a separate episode. Why Trump talks tough but holds back, and how Europe should respond. Let's address the Washington paradox. The president has repeatedly threatened severe consequences for Putin and warned buyers of Russian oil. Yet in practice, the White House has not imposed new sanctions on Russia directly since January, and it has targeted India with tariffs while holding back on China amid trade negotiations. Of course, China is the largest consumer of Russian oil. That is Bloomberg's description of US policy sequencing and restraint towards Beijing. Let's not forget as well that it is also Beijing that is providing some of the most significant components for Russian weaponry, not India. So Trump apparently held back because broader trade negotiations are coming, says Bloomberg, but it seems highly selective to avoid pressuring Russia in a way that provides real deterrence or impose real limits on their war. The critique isn't just European, it's domestic. The Washington Post editorial page says that Putin ran down Trump's 2-week clock and urges measures like secondary sanctions on Russian oil and unlocking frozen Russian state assets for Ukraine, i.e., stop threatening, start enforcing. That is what the Washington Post believes needs to happen. And remember, Zelensky's own caution to would-be deal-makers. If someone supports this crazy idea, he said, who can guarantee that Putin will not continue the war? No one can give guarantees. Well, Zelensky was talking about the so-called proposal for land swaps that had been swirling prior to the Alaska summit. But the inappropriateness and unworkability of that idea means that it seems to have dropped off the radar as a talking point since then. The Kremlin has dropped it also, and in fact claimed that Witkoff simply misunderstood the conversation that he'd had with Putin. This was reported in the Kiev Independent. So why the hesitation in Washington? Well, there are three overlapping reasons. One, the China linkage. The administration wants leverage for a larger US-China trade bargain. That translates into restraint on secondary sanctions that would land squarely on Chinese buyers and their banking channels. That's according to Bloomberg. Two, energy and inflation risk. A hard choke on Russian oil without all sorts of airtight exemptions and contingencies and coordination and ensuring other suppliers risks price spikes. Well, I don't know if that's the reality, but it certainly is the fear. And we can see Brussels' slow roll to 2028 of their full weaning off of Russian oil. That's a clear tell that policymakers still fear the oil price shock. Well, that is from Energy Now. Three, narrative ownership. The White House prefers to present peace as a product of talks that it can brand, that it can control the messaging around, hence the pacing of the pressure. But as the Atlantic Council warns, what's missing is the maximal pressure, the sanctions, security guarantees, long-range strike capabilities, anything that would force the Kremlin to treat negotiations as an imperative rather than optional. That's from the Atlantic Council. But here's my own fourth reason added to this. There is, of course, another reason, one that is implicit. Once you take all the other explanations off the table, what remains, no matter how improbable, how unthinkable, must be the truth. And that option is that Trump wants Putin to achieve some kind of victory in the war and is indifferent not only to Ukrainian victory, but even to its survival as a nation. For much of the duration of the war, Europe has held back out of an abundance of caution, out of a lack of urgency, but also out of a desire to keep pace with the US in the first few years and now to maintain some kind of consensus with the US. But no consensus will happen. Waiting for America to return to something that could be considered normality is a fool's errand. Trump is out at best, batting for the other side at worst. Europe's play must change from waiting to leading, and the sanctions package now heading to DC must include the following. One, close the refined oil products back door, India transshipments, and the laundromat of Russian oil that has worked within the global oil routing. Number two, enforce secondary sanctions on shippers, insurers, banks, and brokers that are enabling Russian oil to be traded above the price cap or entirely outside of that price cap system. Three, target LNG loopholes and dual-use components, and certainly stop servicing Russian LNG ships in European ports. The next priority is to synchronize with security guarantees that Russia sees a linked cost curve. More aggression equals more isolation, fewer access to munitions, components, and tighter capital access. The next point is to enforce loopholes in oil sanctions and to tackle the grey fleet. And of course, if we are serious about a Russian defeat and Ukrainian victory, then taking the frozen central bank assets and using those to turn the situation around in Ukraine would be an imperative. We haven't done that. Clearly, it's not as important as it should be. Europe is already practicing Trump management. Keep him engaged, try to limit the damage he can cause, try to prevent Oval Office-style conflagrations, present their plans, the European plans, offer him a win, even if he has no direct involvement in implementing them, pander to his fallibility. This seems to be the plan. Manage Trump's ego and do what we can in the background. Or as the European Council President Antonio Costa put it, this is about more economic measures to force Russia to stop his war, stop the killing. That's from Interfax-linked coverage of his Uzhgorod remarks via the Euromaidan press, September 5th, 2025. If Europe manages to implement meaningful secondary sanction measures, they will be able to offer Washington a choice: undermine allies or own the unearned success. This is the world of Trump management. Expend vast amounts of time to ensure an adequate outcome is reached and the worst case scenario is avoided. But all the evidence shows, or the lack of evidence of meaningful action from Trump, that the US is out of this fight. They will not exert pressure to inflict a defeat on Russia or place any serious deterrent pressure on Putin. The best we can hope for is that they don't actively assist Russia to win.